All right. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Military Science Fiction panel. And before we start, I'd like to I'll have the panel introduce themselves. So we'll go to the end with Richard. Please introduce yourself.
All right, Richard Fox. I've been writing military science fiction full-time for about 6 years now. I received the Dragon Award for Best Military Science Fiction Award, courtesy of Mr. Larry Correa, who presented it. Thank you, Larry. And I am joined with this really august panel of military science fiction writers. So thank you all for coming.
I'm going to stay seated if you don't mind. I pulled the tendon in the calf of my left leg the other day. Yeah, right leg's the bad leg, not the left leg. I'm David Weber, and I sold my first military science fiction novel in 1989, and I've sold a few more since then. And I'm sort of here as the voice of traditional publishing, while you guys are the voice of self-publishing and indie publishing. So hopefully I can share some of what I've learned and experienced will help you guys.
I'm Rick Partlow. I write military science fiction, and I have for about 10 years now. I had a book nominated for the Dragon Award and lost. Thank you, Larry Correa.
How do you follow that? Hi, I'm Kevin Ikenberry. I write military science fiction, retired Army Lieutenant Colonel. Never thought I'd be an author, and now I write books. It's kind of fun.
And I'm Jonathan Brazee, retired Marine Colonel. Got about 80 titles. I'm a hybrid writer, but mostly indie, and been nominated twice for a Nebula and twice for a Dragon. I didn't win a Dragon because of, thank you, David, thank you, Larry.
I can thank Larry for something now.
But we're talking here about military science fiction, which is the largest subgenre within science fiction. So there are a lot of readers, a lot of interest. But before we start, what exactly is military science fiction? Tony Weisskopf is the editor of Baen, is quoted as saying that military science fiction is written by people who have a clue about how the military actually works, while militaristic science fiction is written by Gene Roddenberry.
I helped her formulate that.
Did you really? That's such a good quote. So I'm going to go down to the panel first, and I'd like you to tell us what you think military science fiction is. We'll start with Kevin.
I think Tony put it very succinctly. Really, I mean, when you think about it, military sci-fi, what we always kind of gravitate towards from a military sci-fi perspective are the stories of the soldiers, sailors, and the Marines that are working together in these environments and doing these things. And you have to have an innate knowledge of how that works, or you have to do a whole hell of a lot of research to make that happen. And you never go full Clancy, but that's a different thing. I think that's what it is. It's written by people who have a clue about it. I totally agree with what Tony says.
I think the difference between military science fiction and space opera that just happens to have military ranks like Star Trek is that the military science fiction is about the relationships between military people and how they work together, the mindset that you have in the military, because it's not just wearing uniforms and carrying phasers. It's there's a mindset you have, the job you do, and the attitude you have towards the people around you. And I think people look at it the way they do art. You know, I don't know art, but I know what I like. They recognize real military science fiction when they see it, as opposed to space opera that just has, ranks like Star Wars.
Well, I helped Tony originate that, so I'm fine with it. I would say that I think that there are also various grades of military science fiction. And good military science fiction deals with the people who are actually at the pointy end of the sword. It deals with the logisticians that keep them there. And I think above all, it deals with the consequences of their being there, both for themselves and for their societies. If it's not the complete package, then it's incomplete as a story. That's just my feeling.
It's what little I have to add to those great answers is that a military science fiction story is going to just pass the smell test for being military. If you watch MASH, you don't watch MASH thinking it's a military hospital. It's a comedy with doctors that happens to be in the middle of the Korean War. So it's you definitely have to have that kind of the idea of like, yeah, these people are in a military unit going about a mission presumably during a war. So that's a smell test for me.
Sounds good. As David said, there's different types of military fiction. You have future gun porn, for example, where you've got all the technology, weapons that blast and everything else, and you have others that are more on a personal level. So I'd like to go, or the character building and everything else. So I would like to, let's discuss the military, the technology that's involved with military science fiction. How important is it, and how do you handle it? So we'll start with Rick on this one.
Okay. I think that it depends on your take, because some people are more into the technology of it, and their readers appreciate that. A lot of people, though, and me included, focus more on the characters. And well, I mean, I have all these notebooks full of notes about how the weapon systems work. Readers don't really care about that, and I try not to mention it too much. And it's just one of those things. Like, you know, if I'm reading a good military thriller, I don't need him to explain to me how the M4 weapon system works. And if it's in the future, I don't expect a novel scene from the character's point of view to think that much about how his rifle works or how his battle suit works or whatever. It just works. It's the weapon he uses. He might just call it, you know, a plasma gun or a rail gun, but he doesn't think that much about the theory behind it, the technology and the details. And I think a lot of people appreciate not having all that force fed to them. They're really there for the mind of the soldier, being in the mud, getting shot at, because that's a universal thing that transcends whatever millennia you're in. That's my opinion.
I tend to do a lot of naval military, and for that, yes, surprise. And for that, the hardware and its capabilities becomes more critical, because it's kind of like, okay, this person is in a band, but you have to know what instrument he or she plays in order to understand the options available while planning your maneuvers and carrying out your operations. I probably, for a lot of readers, include more detail than they want. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the infamous David Weber orders a pizza. You can go look it up if you're not. You know. But I use info dumps. Okay, I know a lot of people tell you not to, and in many respects they're right to tell you not to. I use them because I think you need that information. And as he was just saying, you know, the admiral doesn't say, "Sir, the Japanese fleet is within 40,000 yards," and the admiral says, "Well, then in that case we should open fire with the 60-inch guns," which, as you know, Bob, have a range of 40,000 yards. When they close to 24,000 yards, we should open fire with the 8-inch guns, which, as you know, Bob, have a range of 24,000 yards. So I think it's better for the reader if you give them the info dump, and then if they decide to reread the book, they don't have to reread that part if they don't want to, but they've got the information they need to understand why Honor Harrington, for example, is making the decisions that she's making.
So we're already getting things blown up.
When it comes, it's military sci-fi. So when you're putting in the equipment and the weapons, there's your really easy sci-fi element, not just the aliens. So, but the important thing for me when I'm running is with the tools that the soldiers have, it can't be an easy button. Or it's like, oh, here comes the hordes. Why don't you just set my phaser to obliterate, and then it's all over with. So it's for me when I'm starting is when I figure out, okay, this is the tech level that we're at, and is this tech level going to make sure there's plenty of drama during the whole course of the story. It's never just going to be like, well, I'll just put on the bigger suit of armor and take care of it. So that's one thing is your tech level when you're planning the story is very important. So you need to stop and think, is this tech level going to make it too hard to finish the story, Or at some point, is the reader going to go, he's just cheating by teleporting in a whole battalion of shock troops?
If I may insert one other thing that I meant to say. When you're talking about technology available to your fighters and military technology, what they can't do is more important than what they can do. Okay? You have to give them capabilities that would be really whoop-ass by today's standards, but there have to be things they can't do or that it's harder than hell to do, or else you lose the reader's interest in the story.
Or the enemy won't let them to.
Yeah, yes, that's why they call him the enemy.
I was going to throw in on what David was saying too, because it's kind of the nuances of getting to know a weapon system. I was an armor officer, and when I was trained on the Bradley fighting vehicle, we had these things called Bradley bites. And because of all the little moving parts inside the Bradley, you always had little fingers. Oh, you had cuts on your fingers all the time because there was this rough surface there that shouldn't have been there. So it was a nuanced sort of a thing. So when I write tanks or future kind of armored cavalry sort of stuff, I try to bring in some of those nuances where you have the weapon system that's supposed to do all these cool and awesome things, but what happens if it misfires? You know, what happens if there's something that goes wrong with the power supply? How would you actually have your driver or your loader or your gunner work through those troubleshooting procedures to make that happen? Because that brings your audience more into what you're describing, because we can all write stories where the protagonist always wins and everything is always working perfectly, but it's really when something goes wrong that you get a greater insight to your characters. And those are the fun aspects to explore.
That's actually a good segue to the next question. When you're talking about all these little things that go wrong with the Bradley, that brings out a sense of verisimilitude to military life. And there are people that when I'm talking to people about military science fiction, and I'm looking at the reviews, there's two different types of reviews. That one of them says, oh my gosh, I served in Korea, I served in Vietnam, I served in here, this is exactly what I remember. And then there's the others that say, what's all this military jargon? I don't understand what POW is. And that brings you to the case where every single military phrase, what some people want is that you break the stream of your writing and explain that POW is prisoner of war or CIA is whatever. So when we're looking at the verisimilitude type things, when we're looking at jargon, how do you handle that? And now it's David's turn to start.
I usually handle it by giving them the full term twice, and then connecting the acronym to the full term. And I figured, I respect my readers' intelligence, okay? I told you what it was, here it is. Now I will go back and touch base every so often in the book and use the complete term to remind somebody what it is. Another effective way to do it, although I don't do it that way, is to include a list of acronyms as an appendix. And your reader knows it's there. If they get the acronym, it may break the flow for them because they have to go and look it up, but then you're not breaking the flow for the readers who do know what it is, if you see what I'm saying. And the one thing that I can tell you from all of my military friends is that without acronyms, they cannot communicate. I mean, you know, it's just the way it is.
Guilty as charged.
So I was a field artillery officer, and I can tell you that within a fire direction center, it is entirely possible to spend your entire day saying nothing but numbers, acronyms, and expletives.
And the F word.
And you could do that, but the readers, unless they were a 13 Delta or 13 Alpha, no idea what just happened. So really, the important part is not so much getting the exact diagram, or excuse me, acronym right, but rather just communicating what needs to be happening. And so sometimes, Dave was absolutely correct. Introduce the whole phrase first, then start using the acronym after that. That way, the readers are going to acclimatize. But if you just want to go in the whole, nothing but acronyms, you're going to be speaking Martian to most readers, and eventually you're just going to lose them. So for me, I turn as few acronyms as possible, unless there's a few things that everyone knows, like FUBAR.
Well, I do need to say that good military fiction does not replicate real life in terms of the acronym quotient in the books. Okay, and I say that with enormous respect for the acronym heating real military guys, but in the course of a novel for people who probably weren't in your MOS or whatever, you just got to back off on the acronyms. You have to, because otherwise the reader gets numbed out.
And the Army has a field manual on the Army writing style. We have manuals for everything, but in this particular case, it always talks about when you introduce an acronym, you have it, and then you have explained it with the full term, just like what David is saying. And that's how I've always approached it. It goes back to respecting your readers and their intelligence. Just here it is. This is the acronym, and then continue to move on. And like Richard, I also kind of limit what I do as much as I can. But there's just certain times, especially in dialogue, there's going to be that acronym soup that's going to be thrown out every once in a while from your characters. And if you've done the work as far as having them explain that and you've labeled it out for them, you should be okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I restrict most of my acronym use to dialogue, and if it's a first-person point of view book, you can always have that character thinking about something about the acronym, like how silly it is or how overused it, but something that explains to the reader what's going on. If it's not, then you can explain it a couple times in the book, as Dave was saying. I try not to overuse them, especially since what I write takes place significantly in the future, and I have to make up most of the acronyms.
Kind of pigtailing off of it, whatever. Dovetailing, there we go. Birds, pigs.
We got you, man. It's okay.
Wait, thanks for covering me there. I don't know, but I kind of like the pigtail, because it goes around in a little.
Now you know what the Army's for.
Thank you. We do need the Army for something, I guess.
Damn Marines.
You don't use for PR. You've got that covered.
Yeah. One of the things that a lot of people tend to like about military science fiction is that people who have served like that it brings their experiences into something that they can relate to. So the question is, how much, when you're writing military science fiction that's 1,000 years in the future, 2,000 years in the future, 3,000 years in the future, how much do you transplant current military or military from World War II or Roman military or something like that? How much do you take of that into 3,000 years from now or wherever your universe is set? Richard?
Yeah, it's everyone jokes about when Jesus was a spear carrier, but what happened, what Roman legionaries went through after the battle, during the battle, kind of largely the same what happens now. There's one story when during my first tour in Iraq, there was one of my units was out in Najaf. There was a lot of contact, and I heard that one of my friends had been injured, and no one would say how bad, because they wouldn't tell you, because they were worried you're going to call home, and then his family's going to find out. So there was a lot of anxiety over this lieutenant friend of mine. Where is he? Is he in Germany? Does he need blood? I don't know. No one would tell us. And for just days, this worry about what has happened to my friend. And then finally, his troop comes back in, and he jumps out of a Humvee. I'm like, Bob, I thought you were dead. He's like, no, look. He just got a little RPG shrapnel on his ankle, and there's a little blood spot there. And he's like, that was it. It was nothing. I'm like, you son of a bitch. Why didn't anyone tell us? And so, but then, that kind of, anxiety, that kind of emotion, that's all the way through. So 1,000 years from now, people are going to still be worried about their buddy, and people are still going to be, have a real close call, and their buddy, the call is a little too close for them. And so that kind of thing is universal. That's always going to be there. And if you understand one war and one soldier's life really well, you can transplant those sort of emotions into a future story. And that kind of emotion should stick with the reader.
Kevin?
I think alongside emotion are things like procedures. And we always talk about things like standard operating procedures. And certainly things will change as the march of technology continues, but you're always going to have certain things that will happen. Like, for example, Call for Fire. I wrote a story that's a couple hundred years in the future, and the only review I got was, "Thank you for getting Call for Fire right." I was very proud of that, but it comes back to the procedures. What's going to happen to make the weapon system do what you're going to have to make it do? And I think that if you look at that, you can design a ship, say, for example, in the Honor Harrington universe, and once you've got an idea of what those procedures are, you make that standardized and you bring the reader along. Because that's a certain aspect of what we do in the military. We have procedures and manuals for everything. I'm not joking. So having that and tying it to the emotion, those long-running themes, really does work. It pulls the audience in.
And not to sound too pragmatic or mercenary, but your readers are going to expect, there's a certain reader that reads military science fiction, and most of them have served. Some haven't, but they're very interested. They're interested enough to have read all about it. They're going to know what military, terms and procedures are like currently, and they're going to expect you to use that. And if you don't, and if you don't explain it adequately, they're going to be upset. Even if you do explain it adequately, sometimes they're upset. So I tend to stick with modern military terms and procedures and things like that, because that's what the readers are expecting. And it's not significantly affecting my story, so I figure why not give them what they want.
There's a reason Roman legions normally beat the crap out of huge barbarian armies. And it was organization, it was training, it was standardization of equipment and tactics. That's not going away. The successful militaries are still going to have those qualities. And until we're writing about people who aren't people we would recognize as human beings, okay, they're going to have pretty much the same emotions and the same intellectual approach to their job. What's going to change is the tools with which they do that job. And the degree to which you extrapolate that weapons mix is going to determine the degree to which you have to possibly move away from established procedures into esoteric procedures because you've given them esoteric weapons. But those procedures are going to originate from the same basis. They're going to have the same DNA. They're going to have the same flavor. And one of the problems that people can run into in writing military science fiction is, let me backtrack on that. One of the things that separates military science fiction from militaristic science fiction, using our definition here, is that the reader realizes in reading something that this procedure doesn't make sense, that it's not the way they would really do it, that, and they usually can't tell you why. They really, okay. Some of the folks sitting up here in this panel could tell you why, because of their own experiences, but a lot of people will hit something like that and it will be a false note, and they won't know why it's a false note, but they will recognize it as one. Like having private saluting sergeants. Just saying.
Or a PFC, a major calling a PFC sir, which I did read.
Oh, well, had he won the congressional? Because otherwise I can't see that happen.
Just one thing to add to what Rick said was that I was talking with Mark Recluse one day, and he was talking about a review he had. Mark Recluse, one of his books, he had a Marine Corps where the officers had Navy ranks, which a lot of naval infantry currently do, but the enlisted had current day Marine Corps ranks. And he had people jump all over and tell him, you cannot do that. It's 1,000 years in the future,
I can do what I want.
but you cannot do that. So I think that's...
A lot of people haven't quite grasped the fact that in the Royal Marine Corps and Navy, okay, the rank structure has more in common in a lot of ways with the Royal Navy.
Yes, it does.
Okay, but the procedures have a lot more in common with the U.S. Navy. And it's a fusion. And I've had people tell me you can't do it that way, that's not the way the U.S. Navy does it, or you can't do it that way, it's not the way the Royal Navy does it. And I say, excuse me, what? My Navy, my rules.
I I did get someone, I had a book where they got it involuntarily extended because the war was still going on. And I did get a Marine Sergeant Major email me and said, you can't do that because we, whoever we are, haven't had involuntary extensions for 15 years.
Yeah, I got involuntary extended during my first tour in Iraq, so I don't know where it's going.
Well, you know. Just out of curiosity, how many people out here have served in the military? Okay. Yeah, okay. And how many people out here would like to write military science fiction?
Does that include those who have?
Let's say what? So my question is, and we have a good mixture right here, if you have not served in the military, can you write good military science fiction, which is already a leading question, but how do you, if you don't have to serve in the military, what do you do to make sure that you get the military part realistic? And I think where are we on starting? Richard.
Yeah, Tom Clancy was an insurance agent, okay, and it did not stop him from being one of the best military thriller writers ever. So I graduated from the United States Military Academy. I was on active duty for 10 years. I did 2 tours in Iraq. So I kind of cheated to get the knowledge base. I did it the hard way.
Is that why you did it?
Yeah. But to get to the point where you can write to a great audience and being authentic as possible, I would encourage everyone to read autobiographies from soldiers. There's plenty of them out there, and they will talk about just how awful things are. And then also, just looking at another way I would say is who's heard of Jocko Willink? Okay, he's got a great podcast, former Navy SEAL officer. He gets down in the weeds on military leadership. And if you are familiar with Jocko and you listen to him read his books, he is great at giving really good information on how to do it. So, long story short, yes, everyone in this room can write great military science fiction. You just got to do a little more research or go, serve in uniform. But I think that ship has sailed for a lot of us.
Kevin.
Ditto. I mean, there's nothing else to say than what Richard said. Aside from reading autobiographies or listening to podcasts, all of you that raise your hands as veterans, do it again. Do y'all have "There I Was" stories?
Oh yeah.
We all have "There I Was" stories. Some of them are "No shit, there I was," or we're pointing at our watches.
Shot the watch right off
we
my
got all
wrist.
kinds of stuff. And so having the opportunity just to have a conversation with a veteran will open up something into a totally different area. I'm an Army guy, and I've had long conversations with Marines. I've had long conversations with naval officers and naval aviators about flying procedures and different things. Just because we all like to talk, we all have these experiences, and I can now take those and I can weave them into my book. But then I write that book and I send it to that person and be like, hey, will you check my work? I'm describing air combat maneuvering 1v1 with dissimilar aircraft. Can you help me out with this? And people freak out that I'm an Army guy and I can write that stuff. Well, I use my bevy of friends and mentors. So absolutely have those conversations, tell those stories.
Yeah, I agree on the, there's people out there, some of them you don't even know they've served. You have to ask your friends, ask your family. My father was a nose gunner in a B-24 bomber in World War II. And he told me a lot of stories as a kid that I didn't know at the time were helping prepare me to write military science fiction, because he was telling me, how things happened in his war. And you can get a sense, if you talk to people of different generations, of the things that stay the same. Some things are different, some things change, but between World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, current day, there's a common thread that goes through all of them. If you talk to people who've served in all those, you can get those common threads, and you can give your military science fiction the verisimilitude that will make people think you've served when you haven't. I served in the military. I was never in combat. I guess I should say, thankfully. I was in during the Gulf War, but they didn't send us over there. And I still get people who give me reviews saying, oh, this is somebody who's really been in combat, wrote this, but I haven't been in combat. I trained for it. I've talked to people who've been in combat. I've read their autobiographies, and you can get the common threads, the things that happen to everybody, no matter who's shooting at them or where they are. And you don't have to assert. I mean, it does help, not for just being shot at part, but just the mindset you get when you're in the military, of the little things that, little annoyances that always creep up that are universal through every era. And you know those after having served. But if you talk to enough people and compare notes with what they've said, then you'll get those universal threads.
Well, I'm the only guy up here who didn't serve, which was not for lack of trying. The Navy recruiters were leaving notes to each other about it. So I had petty epilepsy, seizure headaches, and a couple other issues. And come back with any two of the above, and we'll take you. But you crap down. But I have been surrounded by military people pretty much my entire life. My Uncle Steve, my dad, my Southern uncle, enlisted in the U.S. Marines just in time to miss Guadalcanal and retired after his second tour in Vietnam. That my brother-in-law was in for 23 years. So I've got that.
And your son?
And my son, yes, he just graduated Paris Island. About 9 hours ago. But what I was going to say is, I don't know if it's evident from my writing, but I was trained as a military diplomatic historian. That was what I was going to teach at the college level if I hadn't been seduced into an evil life as a writer. And I started studying military history, including the nuts and bolts of it, in probably the 5th or 6th grade. So I'm 69 this year, so I've spent the better part of 60 years studying the subject, okay? And yes, you can pick up a lot of what you need from that. And Richard was absolutely right. Firsthand accounts are killer for something like this. And there are some volumes out there, for example, one that I've got on my shelf is just called Marine, and it's about that thick, and it is entirely essays and stuff that were written by Marines during World War II. And if you want to get a feel for what the U.S. Marine Corps was doing then, that's, absolutely wonderful source. The bottom line is that none of us have been starship captains either. Okay? So we are, by the very nature of the stories that we're telling, we are venturing into places that we have never personally been. And what we need to be able to do is to conceptualize from whatever source it comes, what that place we've never been is like, and then share that with our readers. And one thing that will happen if you're writing military fiction and if you're respectful of the actual military is that your readers will fill in details that you didn't put there because you got the other details right.
One source, if you really would like to get some firsthand sources, hours and hours, walk into your local VFW post and offer to buy a beer. You will hear every story in the world.
Can I add one quick thing?
Yes.
Don't forget military spouses. We still know all the stories.
True.
And if you have a perspective of what's going on the home front with the families,
And
Thank you.
I had a couple more things here, but I think I'd like to open it up for the last 10 minutes to questions. I'm sure you have questions for this, as Richard said, a guest
Can I
panel.
throw out one point
Yes.
that you were going to touch on?
Yeah.
I think it's important for you to decide when you decide to write military science fiction how you're going to handle death.
That was the next question. Go.
Okay?
Why don't we go ahead, Dad?
Because too many people write military splatter porn.
Yeah.
And if only the good guys die, if only the bad guys die, if good guys receive minor wounds and recover or whatever, you're writing pornography. Because especially you guys who have seen combat, it doesn't matter whether you're a good person or a bad person when the fire starts coming in. You're gonna take casualties. And you're writing about human beings. human beings have to deal with the consequences of the most insane thing that we can ask them to do, which is to kill each other. Okay? There are going to be consequences, and you have to deal with those if you're not going to be contributing to the misunderstanding that people who never served have about what the military is. Remember when you were writing that unlike you, the vast majority of Americans' experience with violence is vicarious. They are the most protected people on the face of the earth or in human history. And they are going to form their judgments about what happens in war on what they read, what they see in the movies, what they see on TV. And if you don't warn them about the real consequences for real human beings inherent in what is happening here, you help to engender a situation in which people too easily embark upon a military adventure and then too readily abandon it when they find out what is really involved. And I think that yes, we are entertaining, but we are entertaining about a very serious topic. And we need to be mindful of that and respectful of our responsibilities as the storytellers to remember that storytelling is the passing on of the tribal wisdom. I thought that was...
No, thank you.
Yeah, I think that some of the people who appreciated my books the most were talking about ones where the main characters have to deal with survivor's guilt, PTSD, all the things that happen after you come back from having been at war. And they've, I think the people out there who actually served really appreciate when you deal with that, when you treat them like real people and not murder bots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a psychologist who was a lieutenant colonel in the Army named Grossman. He wrote 2 books called one on killing,
Wonderful book.
yeah, and the other one's on combat. Both great reads. And one of his things that he led with is that, you know, how to put this play. Never mind, we're not going to play. Trying to describe killing to someone who's never done it is like trying to describe sex to someone who's a virgin. It doesn't quite translate. So, and then, but for the people who've been in the military, I'll tell you, for my unit, everyone knew who had kills, and they were kind of this set apart from everyone. So once you know, doing that sort of thing, it has an extreme effect on people. And PTSD, the soldiers who end up suffering from that the most are the ones who actually did the killing, or were really close to it when other people had gone through, you know, take casualties. So trying to describe killing to people who had never done it before is nigh on impossible. But
Well, I have a slight unfair advantage in that respect, in that I was involved in the immediate aftermath of an automobile accident which decapitated the driver. His wife was still dying when I got there. His 2-year-old daughter and his 5-year-old son were in the back seat. Okay? It took me years to admit how pissed off I was with the driver of that car. And that gives me, I think, a little bit more insight into where some of the guys who are carrying that weight around are coming from.
But also, if you can get a veteran who would talk about that, and they kind of understand, you know, what that does to people, it's difficult to do. So.
And even more, I know a couple of veterans who have been in that position, and they both told me that even more than actually killing other people, seeing your friends die and not being able to stop it is really what gets to you the most.
I had a colonel tell me one time that the second worst moment in any combat commander's life is when the intel was good, the planning was good, the rehearsal was good, everybody executed flawlessly, you accomplished all the military objectives, and you have a 19-year-old bleeding out in your arms and you can't put the life back into it, whatever you do. And I asked him, I said, that's the second worst moment. And he said, yep. And I said, what's the worst? He said, when you realize this is what you do best in all the world.
Because all the soldiers that I've dealt with, all the stories I've heard, like Rick, I was never a combat guy. I was in Army Space before Space Force was cool. But one of the most heart-wrenching stories I have was from a friend of mine who his fiance flew into a mountain in Afghanistan in a terrible storm. They were trying to do a rescue operation, but they probably shouldn't have gone. And I've had soldiers talk to me, I've had soldiers cry at my desk, and we sat in a bar one night in Albuquerque with a couple of beers and had that conversation. And I think for me, it's understanding the inherent risk, it's understanding the inherent consequence, and never forgetting that even though they're a fictional character on the page, they are still a life, and they have to be respected, and you have to tell that from not only their perspective, but from the survivor perspective as well.
Okay, we have, go ahead, saw your arm
Just
first.
to throw out a quick comment is, I'm a former cop, and so while I've never killed anybody, I've been close to it, and I've had friends killed. So don't just look at the military to understand that. Talk to police officers. I mean, I suffered from PTSD for years. You know, but
Jim?
One of the things that we kind of glossed over in the differentiation of various forms of military sci-fi is the adversary. Because if you've got two colonies fighting each other and their technology is roughly the same and they're both humans, that changes a lot. And when you've got some alien where you can create an entirely different ethos, mentality, personalities and goals and so forth. Like your adversary who absolutely gave up a whole planet if one of their gladiators got killed. I mean, you can do entirely different things on a whole different level depending on the adversary. And I find that interesting. And it also, I think, must challenge you when you have a non-human adversary to think, okay, what's this backstory on these people?
You have to come up with a whole history for them. It's easier, honestly, when it's humans, because
Yes.
you can go back into history and look at different humans who fought each other. But when you're dealing with an alien, you have to come up with why are they fighting? What do they want?
There's also the problem that the aliens have to be similar enough to humans for there to be points of contiguity which a human reader can attach to.
Right.
Okay, they're doing this because they're aliens. Okay, and you're going like, okay, I understand aliens don't think the way that we think, but they're doing this thing that's totally illogical, unreasonable out here, and there's no connective tissue for a human reader to understand.
Some people
why
have
they
been able
do
to
it.
do that, like armor. The enemy was totally
Well,
inscrutable.
Steve White and I did that in the Arachnid books. Basically, the arachnids were a force of nature, not really a human adversary. But that's what you get into if you make them two.
But you still connected them to something by giving them that metaphorical description. They're a force of nature, or the barbarians, or the
It's like,
technological, or the
in those
humans.
books, the Orions, for example, they're very different from the humans in their honor concept and everything else, but there are other points of contact, and they recognize eventually that honor concepts may be species-centric, but that doesn't make them invalid, if you see what I'm saying.
In the back.
Yeah, I just want to throw something out there. I run a program up at Yosemite National Park for veterans called Tier 1 Base. There's two things going on here. One is PTSD, and that's the limbic system in the human body that keeps you alive, the fight or flight instinct. That's a quarter of what's going on. The rest of it y'all have been talking about is what we now call the moral wounds of war. The stuff you go down the range thinking you're going to free and oppress people and bring democracy to a nation that's never had it, and a 3-year-old has a dynamite vest, you got to kill him. Now, how do you live with that the rest of your life?
Badly.
So when you're writing this stuff, it's not just fantasy, it's not just science fiction. There's a reality that you're going to trigger somebody.
Yep.
Those triggers are going to bring about adrenaline and cortisol and all those neurochemicals. But at the end of the day, it's about being human and what we do to each other and how you react to that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Cards, if anybody wants to know. If you know any veterans that are suicidal, come talk to me, seriously. We're losing 60 a day. They talk about 22 a day. 2/3 of the veterans don't join the VA. Their death doesn't matter. It's serious, folks.
I'd like to thank you, everybody. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. We're out of time. Please come up and talk to everybody. Find out how you can find them, find their books, and everything else. Once again, thank you very much for coming.